Dog tax.
This is Peg. She is 10. She does whatever the hell she wants. She is also the source of all of those noises you heard in the last video. Yeah, that's right. Don't look at the camera. You were chewing a bone. But you had an upset tummy, so I couldn't bear to stop you. And also, I'm very accustomed to her noises. She makes quite a few, so I'm sure she'll make some in here. Hopefully, we will not consistently chew a bone while Mommy is trying to ramble, rave, and rant about the Odyssey and Epic the Musical. But I have paid my dog tax. Welcome back. We are, I do believe, bound to set off from Troy. So this is going to be full speed ahead. Again, we have just gone through The Horse and the Infant, Just a Man. We have really laid the initial foundation building blocks of how Jorge is adapting this musical. Really, The Horse and the Infant sets us up for Just a Man, which I would call almost like the thesis statement of this Odysseus's character. A man who will be having to deal with a lot of external conflict, but whose deep internal conflict is the action of killing Astyanax, and though he can justify it to everyone else, and in terms of Odysseus as he would in the Odyssey, he absolutely would very readily justify it to everyone else, but it's still a horrible thing. The killing of infants is never taken lightly, not even in the myths, even though, the myths are going to show you an alarming amount of family members killing each other.
An alarming amount.
But here we're going to go on to full speed ahead. I'm very excited to set off on this journey. It's going to be Odysseus and his kind of gaggle of crew. We never really know exactly how many people Odysseus takes with him when they sail from Troy. In fact, we don't even really know an exact number or an exact figure of men that he takes to Troy. In fact, in terms of the scholarship, I don't actually think there's any exact numbers for any of the kings, but it's safe to assume that Odysseus would have brought less than a lot of the other heroes, as most of those heroes are kings of city-states that are on the mainland of Greece, Ithaca being its own kind of island. But let's also then remember we've been in a 10-year conflict of sieging a walled city. We will have lost people. In addition, so many problems that the Greeks faced, especially in that final year, were things like supply issues, plague, all sorts of things that happened, which ultimately culminated in the need to create the Trojan horse. So the Trojan horse, or the wooden horse of Troy, wouldn't really have been seen as an honorable way to take the city. It is, again, Odysseus and his epithets, crafty, wily, smart. The man's brain is always ticking. It's a sticking point for Odysseus. And it is something that, only he could have really come up with the idea of the Trojan horse, and the Trojan horse was a necessity because they were having all of these issues of like supplies and illness and everything else, but also they had lost Achilles. And he was the greatest warrior, like point blank period, in all of Greece. They were not going to win without him, so they had to resort to the measures of the horse in order to, frankly, by this point, just end the war as quickly as they could. Ironic, given, again, it took them 10 years to get to this point. Anyway, we will now go full speed ahead. Oh, we brought in that guitar again, which very much can associate with Odysseus. Some nice drums. The ocean sounds I like a lot.
600 men. 600 men under my command, with only one goal in mind.
Make it back alive to our homeland.
Okay, wow. Now I know who the 600 men are. I saw a couple comments on my video on The Horse and the Infant about 600 men. I guess these are 600 men. That is a lot of men. It's a lot of men. It's the likelihood of Odysseus having that many men, even to take to Troy to start with, but let alone by the end of a 10-year siege, it's just unlikely. Now, again, as I mentioned, we don't have any exact figures for the number of soldiers and men that these noted and named heroes were taking with them to Troy. But there's a lot of scholarship and speculation on how many, like just by judging taking historical and archaeological evidence of just like how many people were likely living in any of these city-states and whatever at the time. And the numbers that I have seen most consistently from the scholarship with relation to Odysseus would be probably like average 150, maybe 200. But we've apparently multiplied that like by almost 6 or 3 in the case of 200 to get to 600. Oh my god. I mean, I have to say that Ithaca is a small island. It's something that's constantly brought up with Odysseus when he is compared to the other heroes, these kings of city-states, again, that are on mainland Greece, is that Ithaca is a small kingdom. It is not big. And it's almost treated in a way, like you could say almost like it's the backwoods. It's this small little island that's off the coast of Greece. The likelihood of having 600 men, it's just unlikely. But like from an adaptive standpoint, that is such like a nitpick. Like it's not a sticking point. I just find it amusing because that's such a large number that like is a little unlikely in comparison to like what he could have potentially taken. Again, Homer gives us no exact numbers. Scholarship that I've read tends to all kind of jump around somewhere between like 100 and 200, 150 being like the average. So 600 men, oh my god, that's a lot of men. But okay, you know what? I'm sorry, I'm done laughing. It is editing mad over here for Full Speed Ahead, and while editing this particular section of me being flabbergasted at the number of men that Jorge has given Odysseus, I just needed to check for myself whether I was talking out of my ass a bit. Now, again, as I mentioned in there, Homer gives us no hard numbers for how many men Odysseus had. He doesn't even give us hard numbers for any of the heroes. But in the Odyssey, it is noted that Odysseus takes off from Troy with the same number of ships he brought to Troy. Using Homer again, if we go to the Iliad, there's an entire section of the Iliad, which gets called in scholarship the Catalog of Ships, where Homer takes the time to name drop heroes / kings and the number of ships they brought. But again, he doesn't tell us how many men they brought, just the number of ships. It is at that point you have to use essentially historical and archaeological evidence to go, okay, we are in the Mycenaean period of Greece. Here's the ship technology they had. Here's the ship that was likely being used, which has a kind of range of men it would likely need to make it work, to row it. These ships were long and they needed quite a lot of people to row them. As much as you would say, okay, well, maybe all of the men he brought weren't just warriors. Maybe they were just ship crew. Maybe they were, slaves, either brought from Ithaca or at least when we're leaving, taken as war prizes from Troy. You're also having to bring any potential livestock you would have gotten, any plunder you would have taken in the sack of Troy. So I basically went and looked at various scholarship, looked at classicists discussing the topic. And if I walked away from anything, it's one that I'm not talking out of my ass, but that too, there's so much debate on the topic. Again, we have no hard numbers. The classicists argue left, right, front, center on how many men Odysseus had. The number I given here is actually kind of low. 150 to 200 is what I say. Being generous and sitting here thinking a bit more, being a little more realistic, he probably had about a grand total of 300 men. So you need to have the number that's given in the show. And the reason being, yes, he could easily have left with the same number of ships he came with. The only mention of the Greeks like losing ships in particular would be I think a couple that they willingly left behind and like burned as part of their cover story to make it seem like they had left Troy when they, left the big old wooden horse there on the beach. So they put an image of some ships that had been like wrecked, saying like, oh, see, yep, they were having disease, they were having issues, like it could be part of a sacrifice to Poseidon. Fun fact, Poseidon is the god of the seas, he's also the god of horses, hence they look at the wooden horse and they assume, oh, it's a offering to Poseidon, please make sure we're allowed to get home. It was all part of the big sneakaroo that was being pulled. But you have to, I think, assume, rightfully, in a 10-year-long siege of a walled city, and I keep mentioning it's a walled city because Troy was known for its walls. Like the walls of Troy were basically a character. You're going to lose men because they were fighting all 10 years. They would have battles throughout the 10 years. You have to assume that men were lost, that he didn't come out with the same number of men he went in. And again, as I also mentioned, you had 600 warriors with you because they would be all male from Ithaca in the Mycenaean period. I don't buy it. I don't.
Maybe I'll stretch my imagination to say he had that much when he went to Troy. Coming back from Troy, I think it's more likely he would have had something like 300 grand total. So if he has 12 ships, he's got somewhere around like just under like 30 people per ship, because you could have that many and be able to row those ships. So yeah, again, this is just me coming in to say, ultimately, if you look up the scholarship on the topic and you look at like classicists talking on the topic, real classicists, not me. I am not an accredited classicist. Hence I say I'm a classics nerd or a classics enthusiast. But like accredited classicists talking on the topic, everyone disagrees. Basically, nobody agrees. I've seen the numbers range, again, down from 150, and admittedly, I've seen a couple that go up to 600. But there are no hard numbers. And I will also say, it is me beleaguering a point. It is me nitpicking. And as I also say, it's really not that important. But because while editing, this was something that was bothering me a little. Like, because my reaction is very strong, I admit. Like, I'm so surprised by that number. I had to go and check. I had to go and double check. It was bothering me. And I figured I'd at least share that, hey, I did go check. It's not totally, I guess, out of the realm of possibility that Odysseus had 600, but at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter.
They're all gonna die anyway.
600 men, 600 miles of open sea.
Also, that's
But the
why.
problem's not the distance.
It's what lies in between.
And the cause waiting.
Yes. Wow, we have to stop. One, the 600 men and 600 miles of open sea. I think that's probably why Jorge chose to say that he had 600 men, is he wants to make this nice little, almost poetic parallel of how many men I've got and how far I need to go. The actual physical journey of Odysseus is highly debated because there are a lot of these islands and places that are mentioned in the Odyssey could potentially correspond to actual locations, but nobody knows like the exact route he took. I believe I put up a map in Just a Man, which my grandfather had written some stuff on, where he says this is probably the most accurate idea of like, if you were to try to map out Odysseus's journey, this is likely the route he took. Whether that is actually 600 miles, I have no idea. But the reason I got excited and need to stop, it's not the distance, it's what lies in between. Yes! That is so important. It's so in line with mythology, in line with ancient Greece, because the ocean was terrifying to the ancient Greeks. Absolutely fucking terrifying. There's a reason that so many of these tales from ancient Greece, these legends and myths, involve trips across the water, whether it be like the Mediterranean, the ocean, you're going through the Bosphorus. You know, so many of these stories, if they're not taking place kind of around the mainland of Greece where they're traveling up and around it, they are on the water. And that's because we are in relatively nascent naval technology. I believe the Mediterranean is called something like a nursery environment. So for the development of ancient naval technology, it's like the perfect environment for that to happen. So whether you're getting like the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and all the people who are around the Mediterranean, they were this perfect little ecosystem to start trying to develop naval technology. But it is, again, still in its infancy. The ocean is terrifying to the Greeks. It is, you know, it can be this wonderful thing where it gives you great life. You fish, you travel, you trade, you do all these great things, but it's also death. Like, the ocean is highly unpredictable, especially to the ancients. You know, they don't have weather technology. They don't understand a lot of, like, weather science and stuff that is known now. They can't predict anything. So the ocean is unpredictable. It's unruly. It's unforgiving. It is, I mean, like, the word that comes to mind would be something like ruthless. Like, it just doesn't give a fuck about you. And also, if you think about it, like the Mediterranean will open up into eventually the Atlantic, they don't know where it ends. You can't see where it ends. You can't see to the goddamn bottom. It's a mystery and it's terrifying to the Greeks. And its unpredictability is reflected in its god. I mean, it's really like, it's why Poseidon is often portrayed the way that he is in a lot of the myths. He's highly temperamental and unpredictable. Like, of all the gods, like, you do not want to fuck around and find out with the gods in general, but like, you especially don't want to do that with Poseidon. Like, he is the last god you want to play the game of fuck around and find out with, because Greece is surrounded by water. Again, Ithaca is an island kingdom, and so you depend upon the sea being nice to you, and you're likely going to have to be on the water at some point, and you do not want the god who is a representation of the ocean, who is Lord, that is his domain. You do not want that dude mad at you.
Take notes, Odysseus.
We're not there yet. But this unpredictability, this idea that, like, I have to go on this travel and, you know, I don't know what I'm going to encounter. There's a lot of the monsters of Greek mythology that are, you know, either literally in the water. I mean, think Scylla, Charybdis, the Sirens. This is all creatures who are from the water, but a lot of them will also be kind of serpentine and might live in a kind of wet environment, like the Hydra or the Hydra from Heracles is often in a kind of almost like bog marsh. So water and the ocean and the terror of it and the monsters that it can bring, big deal. Big deal. And so I love that we have this line. It's not the distance, it's what lies in between. Yes, the problem was never necessarily how far Ithaca was. It was all the shit he had to deal with to get there.
Oh, she is. Loyal Penelope. I like the crew also functioning like in a Greek chorus-esque way behind him.
Oh, you're really good.
I don't have too much to say about Eurylochus right now. I'm sure I will have plenty to talk about with Eurylochus. And no shade to the singer, his voice is lovely. Eurylochus is like the worst in the Odyssey. He causes so many goddamn problems in the Odyssey. Like, for a guy who is the first lieutenant, like the second in command, he's the absolute fucking worst. Oh my god. I'm sure we will have plenty to talk about with Eurylochus, so I won't dive into all of it now, because again, I'm sure we're gonna learn some. But he's already coming in here to be a little shit. It's fine.
Run out of supplies to eat.
Cause the war of food source depleted.
600
And especially if we multiply the men to 600.
600 reasons to take what we can. So Captain, what's the plan?
Captain, what's the plan?
Watch where the birds fly.
Watch where the birds
They
fly.
will lead us to land.
They will lead us to land.
There will hunt for food, my second in command. Now for speed ahead.
We're up and away we go. We're up and away we go.
Captain Polites.
Polites.
Look! They're in the
Okay, hold on. Before I have anything to say on Polites, search for food. That is the first stop in the Odyssey, is actually to an island called Ismaris. They get blown off there. Like, they have shit weather from the start. It's kind of interesting how we're not talking about the weather at all in this song, because, like, Odysseus, when he starts telling his story and we start learning, like, where the fuck have you been this extra, like, 10 goddamn years? He knows that the weather was bad from the start. So again, it's not the distance, it's what lies in between, which includes the weather, which could be a combination of Poseidon and or Zeus. He specifically notes that it's Zeus in the Odyssey is giving him bad winds. So he earned some of the ire of Zeus. And that's probably because Zeus, while technically remaining neutral in the Trojan War, mostly because he knew better than to piss off Hera that bad, and she was on the side of the Greeks, he seems to have actually had a little more positive goodwill towards the Trojans than he did towards the Greeks. But he was officially neutral. He knew better than to piss off Hera. But yes, the first stop in the Odyssey is this trip to the island of Ismaris, where you meet these people called the Kikones or the Kikones. Whether or not we're actually going to do that pit stop, I don't know. From the sound of this, we could be setting up that we're going to do that. But it's a pit stop that you can kind of bypass for the streamlining of the narrative. It's probably smarter to go straight to the Lotus Eaters than it is to start with the Kikones, and that's because the whole thing of the island of the Kikones is they roll up and Odysseus' men just raid the place. They raid it, they plunder it, they take what they want, and Odysseus, notes as he says something like, I divided everything equally because God forbid I do something that would like make my men angry, but they were so unruly. The tagline of Odysseus about his men is that they constantly disobey him. They're constantly like mutinying against his orders, which, as much as I would want to be like, bruh, fucking kick them to the curb and go, the types of ships that they were using in this time period, he needed at least the men on his ship to get home. They were long ships. I don't think it's specifically the trireme. I think it is something else because we're in the Mycenaean period. I'll have a picture of it. And these were many oared boats, so you needed all these people to be able to navigate this damn thing. And so they get to the island of the Kikones, and he's trying to be like, guys, okay, we need to go. Like, we need to go. We've got our ship, we got our supplies, we need to go. And his men are just like, no, there is more sheep, there's some cattle, there's some stuff we can take. And meanwhile, the Kikones have been getting more of their own people, and they attack these people who have rolled up to raid their island. And Odysseus loses 6 of his men while he's on this island. These are his first casualties post-Trojan War. And then they are blown out to where the Lotus Eaters are, which is kind of, I would say, the first long stop, if only because it ties very directly into the encounter with Polyphemus. So I'm not sure if we're headed off to the Kikones. I mean, introducing Eurylochus the way that we are, and this very, like, expressive, almost aggressive feeling to the sound of his voice. I'm wondering if we're doing that. It just feels like something that I would cut. You don't need to have it. We've just come off of introducing the Trojan War, and through the sack of Troy, we've gotten the effect of there is violence in this world. And so really the pit stop on the island of Ismaris is to say, like, hey, yes, this is violence. And there was still almost like a bloodlust people still had coming off the War of Troy, because again, they spent 10 years entrenched in that conflict. As much as they were tired and wanted to go home, they ended it on a high note for them, so your blood's up. But also it's to introduce by Odysseus the idea that most of everything that happens is his crew's fault because they don't ever listen to him. Now, Polites. Interesting we're introducing Polites because he is a character that appears in the Odyssey. Let me double check something real fast.
346 minutes later.
Okay, I checked. Polites appears twice in this whole story, and he doesn't have speaking lines. He is noted to be like a dear friend of Odysseus. He's a companion of him, but he's almost a non-entity. He's mentioned, and he's a friend to Odysseus, and spoilers, he dies. He kicks the bucket. He's gonna die. And actually, to tell you, like, kind of almost how a non-character of a character he is, we don't actually even know exactly where he dies. It's between 2 very specific events, like which of the 2 he dies in. I'm not going to say which, because I want to wait and see if and when we get there. It's like, that's almost how of like a, yay, he's a character and he's mentioned, but he's not really a character. He is. So it's interesting we're introducing him, and it seems like we're going to be giving him some, like, serious speaking lines, which, like, interesting we're giving screen time to a character in Polites, but it seems like he's noting, hey, there's an island. So the real question is this Ismaris, or is this going to be the Lotus Eaters? So I'm gonna actually back up a second so I can re-listen to some of that.
Captain Polites,
You're here.
look! There in the distance, I see an island. I see a light that faintly glows. Maybe they're people lighting a fire. Maybe they'll share some food, who knows?
Something feels off here. I see fire, but there's no smoke. I say we strike first. We don't have time to waste, so let's raid the place and...
No, Polites, gear up.
Okay, just by those lines, it seems like we are skipping the island of Ismaris. We're going to the Lotus Eaters first. Again, we don't need to hit the island of Ismaris, but what I like is, again, we're giving Eurylochus this moment of, like, I say we strike first, raid the place and go. I think that's actually, if, as it seems, we are skipping the incident with the Kikones and we are going straight to the Lotus Eaters, it's a nice way to reference that there is a bloodthirstiness to this crew, that there is a kind of hunger to wreak destruction, that they have, again, you could say, like, their blood up from the battle at Troy, and that their first instinct is raid the place, take what we want, get out. But Odysseus, by saying no, and he's saying Polites, gear up, so he's probably like, let's take a small force, which is why I think probably this is meant to be the Lotus Eaters, also saying there's a fire but there's no smoke, so like something is off. There's nothing really off about the island of Ismaris, it's just an island. The Lotus Eaters, however, are a unique place, a unique stop in the Odyssey, so that is what makes me think, okay, we're going to the Lotus Eaters first, which would then segue perfectly into Polyphemus. The incident with the Cyclops, those two things are very linked because you have to go, like, you can't skip the Lotus Eaters and go straight to Polyphemus. You need the Lotus Eaters to get to Polyphemus. But you don't necessarily need the island of Ismarus for anything. But this is also important because we're re-emphasizing, again, Odysseus. His epithet really is like, wise Odysseus, wily Odysseus, crafty Odysseus, clever Odysseus. That man's brain is ticking like a mile a minute. I think back to that ticking noise that's in The Horse and the Infant, and it's just like that's his brain going a mile a minute. And again, this is why he was really a favorite of Athena. Athena, I mean, who appeared as a patron, mentor, guide, friend of many of the Greek heroes. She's very closely associated with most, if not all, of the Greek heroes. She's very directly linked with Odysseus because he was always noted to be, even amongst them, one of her favorites. And it's because of how smart he is. And it is important that if we are constantly talking about how smart Odysseus is, he really is that goddamn smart. Like, he is that much smarter than everyone else. You don't get an epithet like those without being that goddamn smart. So the fact that he's saying, gear up, let's not just go and raid the place, that is, I think, a reflection of, we'll say in this moment, a wisdom of Odysseus, because there's something that he's likely keeping in mind, which is that you don't know who or what is on this island. But also importantly, you don't know if they are at all favored by, linked to any kind of deity. You don't know if maybe these people are the children of a god, or if this is the realm of a god or goddess. You do not, again, want to fuck around and find out with the gods. Okay, let's nerdy fun fact all the way back to the sacking of Troy, an infamous incident that happened there with a character who was mentioned, aka Little Ajax. Again, there's Little Ajax and Big Ajax, usually called Ajax the Greater and Ajax the Lesser. So Ajax the Lesser, Little Ajax, committed a pretty grave sin when they sacked Troy. He raided the temple of Athena during the sacking, and the Trojan princess, the seeress Cassandra, who would later be taken by Agamemnon as a war prize and killed by his wife and her lover later, was clinging to the statue that was in there, the idol, if you will, that was in there. It's called the Palladium, or the Palladium, and that is because Athena was worshipped as Pallas Athena, and she was clinging to this. She was supplicating herself to it, which is she's essentially claiming sanctuary. And Little Ajax did not care. He I think in a lot of the story, it's he gripped her by her hair and just wrenched her off the thing and stole the Palladium and left. The Palladium kind of gets passed around to Diomedes, and he ends up having problems with it later, but Little Ajax gets, he earns the wrath of Athena for that one. She's furious. And this is something that's interesting about the gods, is they do not usually step in when things like this are happening. They very much just kind of let humans embrace a lot of their free will. They will often offer warnings and guidance and counsel to those who are their favorites, but in an instant like that, they're going to watch and see what you do. In the case of Little Ajax, he so offended Athena that when he sailed away from Troy, she had a wind conjured up to completely wreck his ship. The whole thing went down. But Little Ajax actually survives. He's clinging to rocks. And then in a moment that we will never see in history of Greek myth, she teams up with Poseidon. Athena and Poseidon usually do not get along in the myths. It's probably you give a combination, I think, of, again, Poseidon is a very temperamental, emotionally, and unpredictable type character. Athena is usually pretty predictable in how she's going to behave, but also they had a whole little turf war over the naming of the city of Athens as to why it got named Athens, and yet in this case they put aside that beef and she gets Poseidon to help her completely kill Little Ajax. That is how he dies in the water terribly, the tag team of Athena and Poseidon. Both of them notably also supported the Greeks during the Trojan War. So the fact that they went after a Greek tells you how much Little Ajax pissed her off and how important it is to be really careful when you step into a place that's unknown. And Odysseus would know all this. Well, he might not know all the stuff with Ajax because that's sort of happening in the moment while they're on this journey. But Odysseus is a smart guy. He has the whole history of the mythos of all of these characters and heroes and everything else in the back of his head. He knows these. These would be known to him. And so he's thinking, okay, this is a place we don't know. We don't know who or what lives here, especially when you're saying there's a fire and there's no smoke. That's already telling you something's off, which means this might be divine land. There might be gods roaming around. Let's be a little cautious. But also keep a note that this is ancient Greece, it's very bloodthirsty, that they had no problem shedding blood. As a Greek hero, you kind of had to be willing to do that. But I like that we're seeing the contrast of Eurylochus really representing the crew as they are portrayed in the Odyssey, very brash, very impetuous and impulsive, and then Odysseus going, whoa no, pump the brakes, guys.
You and I'll go ahead. You and I'll go
Okay, so he's taking Polites.
We should try
Again,
to
we're giving so many
find a
lines
way
to
no one
Polites.
ends up dead.
We don't know what's ahead.
Give me till sunrise, and if we don't return, then 600 men can make this whole place burn. Now full speed ahead.
There's so much pausing, I'm so sorry. Again, a good note. We'll go ahead. If we don't come back by sunrise, let this place burn. Yeah, it seems like we're skipping Ismarus, because obviously they all went ahead and they just fucking torched the place when they arrived. The Lotus Eaters, there was a bit more caution because of what had happened at Ismarus. Again, adaptive choice. Seems like we're not going to have the island of Ismarus. But I like that we're introducing Odysseus being the guy who's like, he's constantly thinking, intaking the information, and he's trying to gauge the situation and thinking like, what is the best outcome? And really, this
Full speed ahead.
belting for Odysseus is so nice.
Full speed ahead.
We're off, and
Wow.
away we go.
A lot of belting.
Full speed ahead.
And the sounds of the sea. What a nice way to end that song. I love having, again, I've mentioned it before, the idea of these soldiers, these comrades being almost like a Greek chorus in the back. Really, they provide these backing vocals. It's so nice. If there's any sound I almost kind of wish I had the sound of rowing or something. But I think actually the tempo of the we're off, and away we go. I am so sorry. I will try not to ever sing again as part of this. But the driving motion of that, again, we have motion, we have movement, we are on the sea, we are going home, except JK, no, we're not, we think we are. Oh, by the way, we have supply problems. This is kind of like how the Odyssey goes. It's always just like, and we set off. Fuck, we got blown off course. And shit, we're out of supplies. And god damn it, we hit the Cyclops. And like, it's so fun that the song is like, it's moving, there's a lot of motion, but there's all these interruptions from characters. Hey, here's a problem, here's this. But again, I think that motion of the we're off, and away we go is meant to imitate almost the idea of like they are rowing this ship. Hence, the only ones that we're having that are really speaking with their names mentioned are Eurylochus and Polites. Again, Polites. We're giving this dude screen time. I'm actually very curious to see what Jorge does with this character, because again, he's mentioned a couple times in the Odyssey. He is said to be a dear companion of Odysseus, a dear friend of him, but he doesn't really do anything else. Like, he doesn't really do anything of note other than exist. So we're giving him a character, apparently. And then also Eurylochus, the absolute worst. I cannot emphasize how much Eurylochus is like the fucking worst. Again, no shade to the singer. I like his voice. He has a very rich and slightly deeper, but again, like rich, almost like dark, melted, chocolatey sound to his voice, contrasting with Polites, who's very light in his tone and his timbre. He's, as much as he and Odysseus are both in tenor range, Odysseus is doing a lot of very like sort of more traditional, almost like belting, and Polites is way up, sounding almost more like a head voice, but just like a lot lighter and higher, which is interesting. I mean, from a sonic perspective, it helps you tell all the characters apart, but it can inform you about their characters. So again, because Polites is a entity, non-entity, I'm curious to see what we do with him, and giving Eurylochus this, at least in his dialogue, all of this impetuous, forceful stuff. It's nice to see. And again, it seems like we're headed to the Lotus Eaters. Like, these are the hints I'm getting. It seems like we're headed to the Lotus Eaters first, which would mean if we're headed to the Lotus Eaters, we will then be headed to Polyphemus, to the Cyclops, which is just like the Lotus Eaters and Polyphemus are like two of the more very well-known pit stops of the Odyssey. Like, even if you've never read the Odyssey, the actual text, you've probably heard of some of the stops in the Odyssey. The Lotus Eaters would be one of them. Like, a lot of people don't think of the pit stop with the Kikones on Ismarus. It's just not as well known. And again, which is why I say for adaptation, which is, I'm assuming we are cutting it out, especially if I've completely restructured it to start with the sack of Troy. At that point, there's kind of no reason to have the island of Ismarus, because you can bring in the stuff that you need from that later, which is like the unruliness of the crew and their very impulsive nature, in contrast to the way that Odysseus goes around. Well, as presented by himself, at least. Again, he really isn't the most reliable narrator, just by nature of who he is as an individual. And just again, remembering all that we hear of the kind of sailing adventures he goes on are told to us from Odysseus. It's biased. He's going to color it a bit in his favor, except for maybe part of the incidents of the Cyclops, where there is really no way you can color that without coming off looking like you really decided to play fuck around and find out. But no, I like the driving nature of this song and the way that we're leading in to what I assume is our encounter with the Lotus Eaters, which, given the next song is called Open Arms, I think makes far more sense than if we were going to go raid the island of the Kikones. So, let's carry on and meet the Lotus Eaters, I guess, with open arms.